Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend. Normally, when we think about stews, we think a one-pot, inexpensive meal for poor people, right? But today we'll be looking at a fancy beef stew. Thanks for coming along as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. So this recipe comes from the lady's assistant Charlotte Mason, 1777, and her title for this receipt is to stew beef gobbets, and a gobbet means a chunk of meat big enough that you can eat. So she actually says the size of a chicken's egg. Now, this recipe book is not a poor person's food. This is actually fairly well-to-do food. So this is a beef stew for middling or maybe even upper class table. So let's get started on this. It's really simple. Let's take a cut of beef here. This is like a chuck eye roast, something simple. She says not too fat, not too lean. We're going to cut this into our gobbet size pieces. We're just going to cut this into basically large squares about the size of a small chicken's egg. And then we're going to toss these into our pot. I've got our stew pot already heated up over the fire here. We're just going to toss these in and start getting them browned up. And this browning really brings out some of those wonderful beef flavors. This particular recipe doesn't mention this. Other 18th century recipes do mention this step. She probably just left that out. Sometimes when they talk about boiling beef, they say if it's fresh beef, you put this into boiling water. If it's salt beef, you put it into cold water and bring it up to a boil. Here, we're just going to brown it. And now that it's all nice and browned, we can pour the water in on top of this. We want to get enough water to cover these up maybe twice over. And we're going to let this stew for, let's say, about a half an hour, 45 minutes. Depends on how big your pot is. But we want to get this meat really started cooking, and then we'll do some other steps. While our meat is stewing over here, we need to work on the next part of this recipe. We've got some root vegetables and other vegetables we're going to put in here. We've got carrots that we're going to cut up, some turnip type things. We could have any kind of root vegetable. You could have potatoes, turnips are particularly mentioned, and we've got celery. Along with that, we've got a crust of bread that we're going to throw in. It can be a nice stale piece if you've got it. If you don't, well, you're going to throw in a crust of bread, not bread crust or bread crumbs, but a whole crust. Along with these vegetables and the bread, we've got spices. Of course, we've got salt we're going to put in. We've got peppercorns, cloves, and mace. Now, all of these are in their whole form. We're actually going to put these little pieces inside of a piece of muslin or cheesecloth and tie that up so that they don't get lost in our stew. So when it gets done, we'll pull those out. And we've got a bundle of sweet herbs. Also, same deal. We're going to tie these up so that we can take them out later on in our dish so that they don't crumbly bits. The recipe calls for stewing this meat and water here for about an hour. It's time to put in our vegetables and our spices and our herbs. Let's go ahead and put in the bread crust. Once these are all in there, we can give it a quick stir, and then we put the lid on. This is supposed to be kept tight so that it kind of holds in all those flavors. While our stew is finishing up, we just set it off on the fire. It's pretty much cooked already. Just before serving, we need to do our last little kind of fancy step, and that is to fry some toasts in butter. Here is our fancy stew. Fancy because, we've got some special bread served with it, fried. It also had extra herbs and spices in it to bring some of those flavors out. Let's find out how it turns out. We get a little bit of bread there with it. Some of the meat. Meat is done perfectly. It's not too fall aparty, but it will fall apart. Our vegetables, easy to eat, but still have held together Just perfect timing on this. Oh, yeah. And even those sweet herbs and the spices really coming through on this one. Excellent. I mean, and it smelled really good just coming out of the pot. It looks good as a served, something that's served in a nice bowl and everything. So I can definitely see how these stewed gobbets could really turn out looking very nice on a fancy table. This receipt really reminds me of the episode that we did way back in the first season. We did soup, stew, hash. If you want to see another one of these stews, make sure to check out this episode.